very warm welcome to our latest Generation podcast. Indeed, those of you who are frequent flyers with us will have noticed that we've been off the air for a few months. So that was series 1, is now over, and this is series 2. So Generation is the podcast where we talk about mission largely from a Scottish perspective. When I say a Scottish perspective, most of our guests are based in Scotland, although occasionally we do go global. We go over the many borders that this world has to offer. Thanks for sticking with us. Stick with Generation Podcast. Tell other people about it. Today, again, we have a return guest. My guest today is Dr. Alistair Wilson. Alistair teaches here at Edinburgh Theological Seminary. He teaches mission studies. He also teaches New Testament. Good morning, Alistair. A very warm welcome.
Hi, David. Thank you very much. Nice to be back with you. And pleasure.
Yeah, just to get some orientation, I think we first got to know each other. I was thinking that this morning when you were 17 years of age. Do you remember that?
It's getting a stretch of memory, but yeah, absolutely. I remember being a biker in those days and meeting at a prayer meeting, I suspect, was the first time that we had a chance to meet. So, yeah, long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, then you also drove a Fiat Panda, and you were a trainee accountant, and I was a slim, dark-haired young minister, and you attended.
Absolutely.
Bulletin, and of course, I taught you all that you know about New Testament. So,
Indeed, sat at the feet of the master. So it was. It's funny the way that time passes and the recollections, but. Every now and again, I reflect on those days, and I'm thankful for them. They were good days, and it was a real blessing to be part of the early days of the Smithton Church then. I have memories of sitting in the school chairs in the gym hall in Duncan Forbes Primary School, and really appreciating that. I learned a lot from your own ministry and from being part of that church context.
Yeah, well, we appreciate that. I often think of, yourself and James Eglinton, both of you who've gone on to postgraduate studies. James, of course, is a leading Bavinck scholar. You went into New Testament. Can we just, tease out some stuff? Your ministry has really been quite diverse, but it's landed up. I think in quite a sweet spot for you in the intersecting worlds of biblical studies and mission. Just very briefly, do you think that's a sweet spot?
I do. This is a terrific opportunity, a lovely context in which to work. ETS, a heritage that I have benefited from as a student. And then being able to come back in a teaching role. Edinburgh, just such a rich environment for theological study and also for mission studies. All of these kind of connections with the history of mission, the Edinburgh 1910 conference, and then in the contemporary world, the work going on at New College with Andrew Walls and then Brian Stanley and then my colleagues Emma and Alex who are now directing that. There's a real sense of an academic buzz, but also a global perspective, and yet also in ETS a distinctively confessional and evangelical perspective. So that whole combination is really very enriching, and I enjoy the fact that I can continue to be engaged in exegetical work at the same time as working on mission history and contemporary issues of contextualization and such like. That engagement with the text keeps me rooted and keeps me asking what biblical texts and what biblical principles apply to our mission thinking. So yeah, terrific place to be, and very thankful for the way things have worked out.
Yeah, we're first of all, excuse me for sneezing. I've got a bit of a cold. One of the problems of videos is that everything's exposed. But we are where we are. We're actually broadcasting from the same building today. It's a bit of upstairs, downstairs. Alistair is very much upstairs. Can you talk a little bit about Mission Centre, Alistair? I think a lot of folk really don't know what goes on in the walls of Edinburgh Theological Seminary. The Mission Centre is physically located right up at the top. I'm interested especially, let's talk first of all about your master's programme. And can you comment a little bit on the sort of subjects, the sort of thesis subjects that some of your students are engaged in? We don't want to name names, but I'm interested in the broad range of subjects.
Yeah. So the notion of the Centre for Mission is quite a broad concept. It originated with my colleagues here in ETS long before my own involvement. But Scotland's always had a place for mission training, mission education, and many people will associate that with Glasgow Bible College, which became eventually International Christian College. And when that college ceased to operate in the way it once had, my colleagues reflected on that and thought, I wonder whether ETS could make some provision in that and do something along the lines of what International Christian College had done in terms of connecting the academic with the work of mission and ministry in the wider world. So that's where the idea came from. And the idea would be that there would be a range of areas of influence under the banner of the Centre for Mission. And that would include providing people in the churches with mission education, with understanding of their part in God's mission wherever they are. It would involve connecting with our student body and giving them a mission perspective on their studies. It would involve connecting with serving missionaries, however broadly or narrowly we might define that, but people engaged in mission one way or another, and providing them with opportunities either for refreshment if they are on home assignment for international missionaries, or perhaps opportunities for further study, reflection, that kind of thing. And then we wanted to have a formal academic program that would focus on mission. So those are the kind of vision aspects for the centre. In terms of the master's programme, we've been running that now for 3 years, and it's been a very encouraging part of my work. In fact, it's one of the real highlights to be working with the students. It's a taught master's in missiology, although taught in a different way from how it might be envisaged, in that it's not primarily classroom based. We have seminars and we do work through some material together. But to a large extent, students are given freedom over a series of essays and then a longer dissertation to work on topics that would be of particular value or of particular interest to them. So it's a really flexible program. It allows students to have a measure of structure. We have categories like Bible and theology and mission, history of mission, which is, I suppose, fairly self-explanatory, current issues in mission, which is a very broad range of topics. It could be globalization, it could be migration, it could be theology of religion, it could be all kinds of different issues that are pressing in on the church and on mission workers today. And then the final area would be mission into the 21st century, where the emphasis is more on how we look towards the future. So that would include things like reflecting on mission in a digital age, training of mission workers, views of how member care is carried out, how we look after members, how we ensure that there's not a loss of serving missionaries. And so in terms of the topics that people have covered, there's been a whole array because there's a lot of flexibility. And so just a few examples. One student looked at the question of how mission is carried out under lockdown conditions and in a COVID-19 environment, and how that might have implications for ongoing mission. A number of students have looked at the idea of a missional hermeneutic. What does it mean to read the Bible through the lens of mission, asking questions about what the whole Bible, not just certain texts, has to say on mission. Some have looked at the theology of mission, the role of the Holy Spirit, a Trinitarian understanding of mission, that kind of thing. Others have looked at specific issues that relate to their own particular context. One student has done work on the place of women in the history of mission. Some have done work on Islam. One student has done work on beauty as a missional concept. And so a whole array of material, working with a whole array of different authors from different parts of the world. So it's always invigorating to read that material.
Is there any way the Mission Centre could even like do little video clips or publish some of this stuff? You need to get the permission of some of your students, but some of these topics sound really fascinating, and I would love to access some of that thinking. So have you thought about how the Mission Centre can maybe get some of this thinking, from Guardian, Telegraph level down to Daily Mail level?
Sure. So certainly the more that I am working with students, the more that I'm seeing the kind of work that they're doing. There's some outstanding work, and it's definitely the kind of material that would be valuable for others to read. Challenge is often a matter of time and fitting everything in. But what I have been doing actively is encouraging students where they've done a particularly strong piece of work academically, but also in terms of communication. I've suggested that they might publish an article. So again, it might not get quite the level of exposure that we might want, but at least it becomes something that's not hidden away on a hard disk, but is given public exposure. And a number of students have been thinking or actively submitting work for publication in journals, such like. The other thing that can be done in a much more general sense is to publish online. So whether that's done through a blog or whether it's done through, again, more formal structures for online writing. I've been encouraging students to be thinking how they can share what they're doing. In terms of videos, I think that that is definitely a way that we can be looking to develop in the future. Not everybody feels comfortable in front of a video, and certainly I can empathize with that experience. But I think that you're right, that short videos where there's a personal engagement with an individual as well as with the idea is a really helpful way to go. So I'll be looking at that. I would love to see some of the work that's been done here get that wider exposure. And it's definitely on the to-do list.
Okay, just this week, in fact, yesterday, we're talking about theology and the academy. Yesterday, I heard of a new book that's been released on Christology, and it's written largely from an African perspective. I think you've got some involvement in that. Can you comment on that, the genesis of that volume, and how useful it would be for the UK Church?
Sure. The volume, Who Do You Say That I Am, is one of a series of volumes that has come out of an organization called ASET, A-S-E-T, which is the Africa Society of Evangelical Theology. And that scholarly body, that theological society, is rooted in Africa. It meets typically in Nairobi in Kenya. And in March 2020, just before the world came into a very different period, I had the chance to travel to Nairobi and present a paper on Jesus as the Lord of Mission, engaging with a couple of distinguished African theologians, Kwame Bediako and John Mbiti. And I used their words and their ideas as a starting point for considering Jesus as the Lord of Mission. Also drew in a little bit of J.H. Bavinck, so some Dutch missiology as well as the African. So that the series has been running for a number of years. This is certainly, I can't remember, is it the 5th or the 6th volume, or perhaps even more, but it's certainly one of several. And typically, those who were presenting at the conference were based in Africa, either in Kenya itself or in other parts of Africa. I made a lot of friends from Kenya, but also from South Africa and other locations. And it was a real blessing to be part of that. I think that so often, just for geographical reasons, we live our lives and the massive information that we could engage with, we live our lives fairly constrained by certain existing connections. And I found that to go to a theological conference in Nairobi was hugely enriching. I met mostly people that I had not met at any other theological conference in the UK or in the States. It was a different constituency. And it opened up opportunities for conversation, for thinking about the questions that people were raising there. So this volume, it is a set of academic papers. So in a sense, then that is probably going to appeal particularly to those who would read theological writings anyway. But I think it's a really helpful way of engaging with the ideas of evangelical African theologians. Many of these people will not be household names to the folks that we are rubbing shoulders with day to day. And so just to expose ourselves to different voices, to hear what people are saying. These folks are distinctly evangelical from a range of theological traditions, but confessing evangelicals, and would therefore work with principles of scriptural authority and the centrality of Jesus as the crucified and resurrected Lord. And with these frameworks in place, we have common ground, but also a very different experience and different questions that come to mind when we do theology. So I think it would be perhaps a challenging read if you weren't used to theological studies, but an interesting read. And it would be a great way of engaging with that wider world of African theological thought.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of scenes in my mind just now. One is having dinner with a Presbyterian pastor and his family in a suburb of Johannesburg. The guy is, really, really poor. He's got 5 or 6 books. I mean, behind me, behind you, we've got quarries of books, know. And if you go into an American pastor's office, he'll just have an office for his books alone. We are wealthy. Can you, or if I go to the Eastern Cape and I talk to, some of the pastors there in the villages in Transkei, can you tell me how thinking, as demonstrated in this book in Christology, is eventually helpful to these guys on the rock face of, a shanty town, a slum, or a rural village?
I think the core of theology is how we understand who God is, what he has done, and how we are called to relate to him. So in some senses, those life-giving aspects of scriptural truth and theological thought are going to be transformational in any context. The question often is, as you say, how do we get to the place where we can provide access to creative thinking, to accurate thinking on the Bible, on theology for people with very limited resources, and also in a way that is relevant to their particular setting, that deals with the kind of issues that they're dealing with, that asks the kind of questions that they're asking in their kind of language. So the volume that we've been talking about is published by Langham Publishing, and I've mentioned Langham in conversations before, but a hugely valuable and important ministry. And one of the things that they have made a distinctive of their work is to give an opportunity for people from the majority world who are developing as writers, who are developing as thinkers, to have a forum for publication. And that provides volumes then, which are written within the context of African theological discussion and society, with all the diversity that involves from different parts of Africa, from different African nations and cultures and contexts, but a distinctly African set of questions and agendas that are available then for pastors in these particular areas. And Langham also has worked hard to make those kinds of resources affordable. So working in partnership with African publishers and with local distributors, they will provide resources for the church in the majority world at a price that we wouldn't typically be able to access books in the West. And then on top of that, there is a commitment to providing resources for theological colleges. So when I was at Dumisani Theological Institute in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, we would get an annual grant from Langham of literature, some literature of their own, much of it at that stage coming from Western authors, but solid evangelical writers who the grant would allow us to put each year a number of books into our library, which would then provide for people in training. And we would then try and make that as accessible as possible to pastors and those who are working in our region. Now, what Langham are able to do more and more is point people not simply to Western authors who can be brought, or their books can be brought into Africa or elsewhere, but to authors from Africa and Latin America and Asia who are writing their own work, and that's now available for these pastors. So it's an ongoing problem. Resources are limited, and we certainly have such riches in our particular context. But I'm thankful to see ways in which those opportunities for thought and for reading and for learning are being made available.
That's fascinating. Now, someone may say, okay, you guys in Scotland, you've got all your books and you've got all these resources and you've got, phenomenal access to privilege. And yet, you're 3-4% evangelical. Someone was talking recently about the national churches, CFS minister, in fact, in an open forum was saying, we've lost a congregation every week for the last 15 years. So an African could say, you look at Latin America, you look at Africa with our, we don't have the books, and yet our churches are booming. They'd say, listen, you want to exchange your bookishness for our spiritual power? Hey, come on. Well, what would you say to that?
I think that we certainly have to listen to the voices of people in places where the church is growing, because although growth is difficult to define, there are clearly places where the church is thriving, that there's a real evangelical faith, and there is a real sense of God at work. And that has a credibility all of itself when we see the Spirit of God working It should make us sit up and listen. I think that the Spirit and the Word are inseparable. The Word of God is that which cuts through all of the separation and the division and the misunderstanding and the willful, deliberate rejection of God's truth. And so whichever context we're in, we have to see God's Word free to have its impact. So work like Bible translation and so on is still going to be so important. It's going to be essential that people have access to the Bible. But I'm often drawn back to the story of the Ethiopian official in Acts when Philip asks him, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And so this senior African official has a Bible available to him. He's able to read it in his own language. He's reading Isaiah, but he's almost certainly reading it in a Greek translation, which made it available to him. And Philip says, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And he says, "How can I unless somebody explain it to me?" So as well as the leaving people with the Bible, there has to be some way of enabling training, learning, growing in understanding, as well as growing in spiritual power. And so I think that the church needs to think as a whole about how we can work in collaboration with each other, how we can share in the task of looking out for the health of the whole church in all parts. And of course, one of the interesting things that's happening is that mission workers from some of the areas where the church is thriving are now coming to the UK and to Western Europe and are bringing their evangelical faith and witness to areas where the gospel has had an impact in the past, but has seen that wane in recent years. So, I think that it's absolutely the case. We shouldn't be setting up a barrier between the Word and the Spirit, and we shouldn't also be saying, well, because we have the learning, we have privilege in this conversation. Some way or other, we have to grow relationships that allow each other to share what we have, where we see God at work in our context, and learn together in that process.
Yeah, that's great. Moving swiftly on, you mentioned J.H. Bavinck. I've got Dan Strange coming on next week. He's doing the podcast. He's got this new book about magnetic faith. Uncle Herman was a poster boy for years and years, and Bavinck studies are huge. But I'm sensing in the last few months a growing interest in J.H. Bavinck, the nephew, who wrote, of course, the seminal book, The Science of Mission. Can you just comment what you think this I think it's on the back of Uncle Herman's popularity. J.H. is beginning to be swept in. Can you comment on the insights, just the headline insights that maybe J.H. Bavinck has for missiology today? Because again, we're talking about 50, 80-year-old theology now being revived.
It would be a dangerous thing for me to comment too much on J.H. Bavinck if Dan Strange is going to be speaking to you next week. But I've really appreciated reading Bavinck. I think you're absolutely right that the level of serious interest in Herman Bavinck, who was, as you say, his uncle, has led to a further interest, an offshoot of that interest. And probably that's part of a wider interest in Dutch neo-Calvinism, not least due to the work that's been done in Edinburgh by our friend James, but also work that's been going on for many years in Calvin Seminary in the States and so on. There's always been a heritage of Dutch work, and it's strange that Herman Bavinck's work used to be available in little bits and pieces in translations from the Banner of Truth. I remember long ago, maybe on creation, was it, one of his works of it, and never really took off. So there's some kind of moment, kairos moment, so to speak, here that people have taken a real interest in this. I think that one of the interesting things that's characteristic of that whole movement is the notion of Christ's lordship and Christ's lordship over every sphere of society. It's a very holistic view of life and of ministry. And I think that's been very influential in what we might call integral mission in a different context, that the notion that every sphere of life is under Christ's lordship has an impact on how we live in our faith, in our churches, but also in our day-to-day lives, in our offices and schools and wherever else we may work. J.H. Bavinck, I think, he wrote a number of shorter books. He doesn't have the same volume of work that his uncle Herman had, but there are a couple of things that have struck me about his work. One is just how biblical he is. When I was writing my paper for the volume that we've talked about, one of the things that struck me was how Jesus as the Lord of mission, Jesus as the one who acts in the work of making the faith, the confession that Jesus is Lord, that he is risen from the dead. Jesus is, in Bavinck's thought, identified as the one who initiates, who motivates, who empowers all of that work. And that seemed to me to be hugely valuable. He thinks biblically, as a sort of biblical theological approach to mission. He also has a notion that people are shaped by the reality of sin. So studies on Romans 1, that suppressing the truth in unrighteousness is not unique to Bavinck, but he has a very realistic notion of where humanity is, and therefore the necessity of God's power to break into that and to bring understanding. And I think that what Dan does is draw on his sense that there are fundamental longings, fundamental desires, fundamental questions in each person that the gospel provides the most full and essential answer to. And so he was very conscious of the gospel, of the theological truths. He is thoroughly rooted in the same theological heritage as his uncle, but he was also very conscious of context. And he had served as a missionary in Java, what we would call Indonesia now. And as he was there, he was thinking about how that gospel message can be accessible linguistically, how you make it available to the people in a language they can understand, and also how the gospel engages with the existing questions, beliefs, cultural processes, and how he has this notion of possessio, possession, where Christ does not reduce all of the existing cultural framework to nothing. Christ will challenge some of it, but some of it he will bring under his lordship. He will bring a new meaning and life and holiness to it. So I think that theological rootedness, that biblical theological understanding of mission, and that cultural sensitivity would be three areas that I can think of.
Great. Okay, Alistair, I mean, time's flying by. I tend to, move from one subject to the other here with a bit of a butterfly effect. Can you just close by, you actually lived in an African context. Can you just comment on how that changed you? I'm conscious that many of us experience change in our lives. Alistair Wilson, I knew at 17, is the same as he is today, but he's also different, as is the David Meredith way. And change in my life has rarely been, revolutionary. It's largely evolutionary. But can you reflect on just some ways in which living outside of Europe has changed you?
It was a remarkable opportunity, a remarkable providential provision to have that opportunity. It really hadn't crossed my mind in any significant way that our lives might be relocated to a different part of the world. And I'm deeply thankful for that. It's not necessary for every Christian to have that to develop in their thinking, but I do recognize that it's certainly changed my thinking, my attitudes, my path in life to a significant degree. I would say that one of the things that struck us as we went as a family was the warmth and the kindness of people that we met in South Africa, the different ethnic backgrounds and heritages that they had, but we found to a large extent a warmth and kindness and drawing in of this group of very pale Westerners into the nation. One of my friends, who was a fellow missionary, when he saw me arrive at the airport for the first time, said he thought that he had never seen someone so pale as me, so sort of bright, shining white with this skin that hardly ever saw the sun. And so we were clearly very different, from a very different culture, very different experience, and the people were exceptionally welcoming and gracious. We also were struck by how many Christian people were in that country, how many people we could expect day by day to meet who would express themselves in terms of their faith in Jesus and their love for Jesus. And we sometimes found that they did that in a way that was different from what we were used to, in a way that was a little puzzling or a little unsettling. But I think we also learned to accept a measure of difference, to accept that not all Christians say exactly the same thing or do exactly the same thing, and certainly not all the way we do it. And so I learned to try to listen. I'm sure that I went with many of the preconceived notions about how I would bring order to people's thinking and how I would contribute from the riches that we had experienced in the West. I think that I learned to be more ready to listen, to be more ready to consider an alternative perspective, to hear what the experience and the faith of the people in that part of the world was. So, I think that in practical terms, it has definitely made me more deliberate in seeking to find voices from Africa, in seeking to find friends from different cultural contexts where they can share what they've experienced with me and that we can benefit from that. So I think that it was a hugely valuable, a hugely transformative experience. Very grateful for it. I hope that we contributed something of value, but we certainly were changed by going to Africa.
Alistair, thank you so much for giving us your time. If listeners want to know more about ETS, get in touch with us, especially in the mission programme. We've got something for everybody. I think we can help there and you can help us. Thanks for sharing some of your story, Alistair, and we wish you every blessing in your academic work and in your family work.
Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Generation Podcast, folks, thank you. As I say, we have Dan Strange next week. He'll be talking about his new book. I hope to get James Eglinton on sometime if I can get him. He's a bit of a celebrity these days, so it's difficult. I'll speak to his agent and see if we can get him on to talk about JH and Herman. We will talk. I want to talk more with majority world folk. I'd love to talk more with our African friends, our Asian friends, our Latin friends. So that's the aspirations that we have for this podcast for Series 2. Thank you for sticking with us, and we wish you every blessing and have a great day. Thank you.